I'm non-zero sum James, your companion on this exploration of win-win games. Getting aligned through history. The alignment problem no one is talking about, part 3. Man is by nature a political animal. Aristotle. In part 2 of this alignment series, we explored the political polarization of individual and collective interests, and revealed a reaction to this in a burgeoning centrist movement. We have identified the problem, and I intend to give equal time to proposing solutions. Let's first ask, is centrism the answer? We've discussed that polarized politics in a democracy can land policy somewhere in the middle, and that these compromises often lead to suboptimal, zero-sum outcomes, with no one really getting what they want. Centrism too can gravitate to compromise, reinforcing the status quo. The case of UBI. Take, for example, universal basic income, which is still considered a radical option, and yet it has left-wing supporters like Rutger Bregman and right-wing proponents like Milton Friedman, and is marketed by business-savvy political hopefuls like Andrew Yang as a solution that suits the interests of individual freedoms and collective well-being. UBI promises to not only provide for the least fortunate, satisfying the collective interests of leftists, but to also do away with the bureaucracy of means testing, maybe even precluding the need for left-leaning policies like minimum wage, appealing to small government libertarian individualists. However, because centrism can reinforce the status quo, radical ideas that suit both sides may not make the Overton window. So the Overton window comprises the policies that are publicly acceptable. Whether you are inside or outside makes you politically realistic or unrealistic. And UBI is one of those strange policies that can find itself on both sides of the political spectrum and yet still outside of the Overton window. So is there a way to collaborate to create solutions that cater to the individual and the collective? History shows us there are. Tory men and liberal policies are what have changed the world. Richard Nixon. Nixon and liberal policies. Nixon's quote was one he hoped to embody, advocating not for compromise policies, but for a bold open-mindedness to the merits of opposing viewpoints. And while it is debatable whether he achieved this during his tarnished presidency, Nixon's statement was not entirely empty. His government created the Environmental Protection Agency and initiated affirmative action policies in federal contracting. He also toyed with a form of UBI back in the 70s, but eventually abandoned the idea. John Key and marriage equality. In my own country of New Zealand, it was John Key's right-wing Conservative National Party-led government who passed the Marriage Equality Bill, recognising same-sex marriage. Like Nixon, Key was open to enacting policies whose time had come, regardless of political alignment. It's important to point out that these policies would not gain any headway if not pushed forward by progressive political movements. Political conservatism can be seen as a gatekeeper to progress, performing the function of delaying premature or unproven radical changes. So how do you prove new policies? Ibram X. Kendi and self-interest. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi looks back at the struggle for racial equality in America and demonstrates what he calls suasion, the demonstration of a demographic's worthiness or value, as an ineffective strategy for changing policy. Rather, he discovered that the source of racist ideas was not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. Kendi realized that racism was a tool to maintain power, so proving one's own worthiness is pointless. Successful approaches had to consider the self-interest of the powerful. For some, this might feel unfair, that a group looking for equal rights needs to consider the interests of the very people who are oppressing them. And it is. So when Kendi argues that a more equitable society would be more prosperous and stable, promising benefits to the individuals in power, he also encourages activism and protest to make maintaining racist policy difficult. This creates a situation where it is in the self-interest of policymakers to change racist policies. J.S. Mill and women's equality. Fighting for one's own rights isn't the only option. John Stuart Mill in The Subjection of Woman, which he developed with his wife Harriet Taylor Mill, argued for women's rights from the perspective of the dominant power at the time, men. Were women as well educated as men, their conversation would be as useful, as agreeable, or as interesting to men as that of men is to women. J.S. Mill. As comically pompous and aggrandizing of men's always useful, agreeable, and interesting to women conversation as this is, Mill is appealing to the individual interests of men at the time, and adding quite a large serving of flattery as well, but he's doing this in service of a collective value, equality of the sexes. He draws attention to the fact that deliberately denying women education means that men are doing themselves and their progeny a disservice by guaranteeing themselves a life spent with a less educated partner and parent. He also criticizes the impulse to make one's partner less as a form of intellectual weakness. It is always a proof of the low level of the understanding when persons are fond of the company of those who tell them nothing but what they knew before. J.S. Mill. As a utilitarian, Mill was concerned with creating the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And well before the birth of game theory, he was aware that this proposition was a non-zero-sum game, one where the sum benefit could increase for a collective comprised of individuals. A final example from history. There have been quite a few examples. Now we're on to Aristotle and the political animal. Right back to Aristotle, thinkers have emphasized that humans do not live in a vacuum. Challenging the idea of the self-made man, Aristotle's concept of polis, embodied in this episode's opening quote, "Man is by nature a political animal," held that humans are by their nature political, because the individual is reliant on the collective. The individual, when isolated, is not self-sufficing, and therefore he is like a part in relation to the whole. Aristotle. Aristotle understood that humans are making individual and collective choices simultaneously, and that the best choice was one that followed the same utilitarian calculus as Mill, the greatest happiness for the individual and the collective. In this way, Aristotle, who was interested in how one could make virtuous decisions, was arguing for a sort of Nash equilibrium between the individual and the collective in order to evaluate good choices. So, we have seen from thinkers and politicians such as Aristotle, Mill, Kendi, Nixon, and Key that humans have always been concerned with aligning the interests of the individual and the collective, from enacting policies of the opposition to considering the self-interest of those in power in service of collective goals. This is because these thinkers appreciated that aligning the individual and collective is non-zero sum. We know it is very possible to make decisions that are bad individually and collectively. Equally, there are decisions that are beneficial to both the individual and the collective. In fact, there are lots of them. In the next part, we will explore the nature of humanity as a social species, why we naturally cooperate at some times and fail to do so at others, and point towards a radical way to overcome our limitations.